They didn't warn her, they just cut the axle. Edgar Holloway's men had done it the night before, quiet, clean, the kind of sabotage that looks like bad luck until you're 9 months pregnant, bleeding from a gash on your temple, and the wheel is already gone. They knew exactly where she'd be. They knew exactly what would happen. And not one of them lost a single night's sleep over it. That's the kind of men they were. Now, Evelyn Ashcroft was alone on a mountain trail with a storm building behind her and a chest full of evidence her dead husband bled to keep safe. And somewhere out there, those same men were riding hard to finish what they started. If that were you out there, 9 months along, no help coming, hunted by men who'd already killed someone you loved, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this move something in you, please hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, and if it touches your heart, hit that like button. Now let's go back to that mountain trail, because what happens next will stay with you. The morning Evelyn's world collapsed had started so ordinary that she almost felt cheated by it. She had woken before dawn, the way she always did now, because sleeping through the night had become something her body simply refused to allow. The baby pressed against her ribs from the inside with what she privately thought was deliberate cruelty. Not malicious, just insistent, like someone knocking on a door that was already open. She had lain there in the back of the wagon for a long moment, staring up at the canvas overhead, listening to the wind move through the pines and counting her breaths, the way Dr. Harmon back in Billings had told her to do when the fear got too loud. 3 days, maybe 4. That was how far she was from Bozeman. She kept telling herself that. 3 days to Bozeman, where her sister Margaret lived in a house with an actual wooden floor and a cast iron stove that could heat 2 rooms at once. 3 days to somewhere safe. 3 days, and this whole terrible chapter of her life would close. At least enough that she could breathe again, really breathe. Not the shallow, careful kind she'd been managing since the night they brought Robert home on a wagon board with his hands folded across his chest, and his face so still she hadn't recognized him at first. She'd been telling herself 3 days for the last 2 weeks. The number kept stretching. She got up. She built a small fire, not big enough to be seen at distance. She ate a biscuit she didn't taste and drank water that was too cold. She harnessed her 2 horses, Clem and the younger mare she'd never gotten around to naming, and she climbed back onto the wagon seat and told herself, again, 3 days. She made it 4 miles before the wheel gave out. It didn't collapse all at once. That was the cruelest part. It started as a sound, a low grinding from somewhere beneath her that she first took for a rock caught in the wheel spoke. She slowed down. She listened. The sound stopped. She kept going. Half a mile later it came back, louder, and this time there was a shudder through the whole wagon frame that traveled up through the bench and into her spine and made the baby kick hard in response. She stopped on a trail that wound between 2 steep ridges with timber on both sides and absolutely no one in sight. She set the brake. She climbed down, which at nearly 9 months was its own kind of small disaster, involving a grip on the sideboard and a controlled drop that landed her on both feet but sent a sharp ache through her lower back. She walked around to the front right wheel and crouched down as far as her belly allowed and looked. The axle was cracked almost through. Not from where. Not from hitting a rock wrong or crossing a stream at a bad angle. The wood was cut. She could see it even without touching it, a clean diagonal slice that went most of the way through and then let the road do the rest. Someone had taken a saw to it. Someone had known exactly where the wheel would bear the most weight on this particular stretch of trail. She sat down in the dirt right there beside the wheel because her legs stopped cooperating. She thought about Robert. She thought about the last thing he'd said to her, lying in the bedroom of their homestead with Dr. Harmon's expression carefully blank behind him and the sound of men on horses outside that neither of them acknowledged out loud. He had taken her hand and held it with a strength that surprised her, given everything, and he'd said, "Evie, you get that chest to the marshal in Bozeman. You hear me? Not the county sheriff. Not anybody local. The federal marshal. Promise me." She'd promised. She sat in the dirt beside a ruined wheel on a deserted mountain trail and thought about that promise, and she did not cry. She'd used up most of her crying in the weeks after Robert died. What she had left was something harder and less clean than grief. Something that had no comfortable name but kept her moving when moving was all she had. She got up. She checked the horses, who were calm in the particular way horses get when they know something is wrong but have decided it's not their problem. She checked the chest in the back of the wagon, iron-bound, padlocked, the key on a cord around her neck where it had been for 3 weeks. She checked the rifle she kept under the wagon seat. Then she stood on the trail and looked both directions and tried to think. She could unhitch one of the horses and ride, but she couldn't leave the chest. The chest was the whole point. Without it, Robert's death was just a man dying of injuries sustained in a fall, which is what the official report already said. And everyone who'd colluded in that lie would go right on living comfortably while 43 homesteader families waited to find out whether they still had land to farm. She couldn't carry the chest. Not in her condition. The thing weighed nearly 60 pounds. She could wait. Someone might come along. This was a secondary trail, not a main route. She'd chosen it deliberately to avoid being seen, but someone might still pass. A rancher, a trapper, a supply wagon heading north, or Holloway's men might come first. She looked at the sky. The clouds to the west had the color and texture of old bruises, moving faster than they should have been. She had grown up in the mountains. She knew that sky. She went back to the wagon and got the rifle and set it across her lap and waited. She had been waiting for about 40 minutes, long enough for the wind to pick up and the temperature to drop noticeably, and for the baby to settle into a rhythm of pressure that made it hard to sit straight when she heard hoofbeats. Her hands were on the rifle before she consciously decided to move them. One horse. Coming from the north, which meant coming from deeper in the mountains, not from any town. She tracked the sound as it got louder. Not fast, not the hard gallop of men riding with purpose, but not slow either. A steady pace. Someone covering ground. She made herself not stand up. Standing up was not going to help anything. She sat on the wagon seat with the rifle across her legs and her face arranged into something she hoped looked less desperate than she felt, and she waited. The rider came around the bend at a pace that slowed almost immediately when he saw her. He was a big man, that was the first thing. Not in a soft way. In the way of someone who'd done physical work for a long time and had the kind of build that came from it. He was probably somewhere past 40, though the mountain sun made ages hard to read. His horse was a dark bay, well kept, and he sat it with the loose ease of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than out of one. He wore no expression that she could immediately read, which she'd learned was sometimes better and sometimes much worse than a man with an obvious expression. He pulled up about 20 feet from her wagon and looked at the wheel without being obvious about it. Then he looked at her. She looked back. "Wheel's gone," he said. Not a question. "I can see that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wheel again, then up at the sky, then back at her in a way that moved over her whole situation with a careful kind of taking stock that reminded her of the way experienced men looked at a damaged fence line, assessing the full scope of the problem before deciding whether to engage with it. "You're alone," he said. "Also something I'm aware of." He didn't react to her tone. "How long have you been here?" "Long enough." He sat there on his horse and she sat on her wagon seat with the rifle across her lap, and neither of them moved. She was aware of how she looked. She'd been on the trail for 3 weeks. She'd washed when she could, but that wasn't often, and her coat was stiff with dried mud at the hem, and there was dried blood at her temple from where she'd hit the side of the wagon when the wheel started to go. She'd almost forgotten about that, which probably said something unfortunate about her current state. She looked like exactly what she was, which was a woman who had been surviving rather than living for some time. She watched him look at her, and she held herself absolutely still. He said, "There's a storm coming." "I know. Bad one. You've got—" He paused, appeared to calculate something. "Maybe 2 hours before it comes down hard. Then I'd better figure something out." He looked at her for another moment. "You got anyone coming for you?" The question hit a place she'd been carefully not pressing on. "No," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked at the chest in the back of the wagon. It was visible, though not open. She'd covered it with a canvas tarp, but the shape was obvious, and the iron corner fittings were showing. He looked at it for exactly 1 second too long, which meant he'd noticed it and was making himself not ask about it. That told her something. "I've got a ranch," he said, about 6 miles north. It's not much, but it's solid, and it'll keep the storm out." He paused. "I can take you there until the weather clears." She studied him. This was the calculation she'd been running the whole time they'd been talking, the one that lived underneath every word. He was a stranger. She was alone. She was 9 months pregnant. She had 60 pounds of evidence in an iron chest that men with guns had already killed once to get back. Trusting the wrong person wasn't just a bad idea. It was the last bad idea she'd ever have. But the sky behind him was the color of slate now, and the temperature had dropped another few degrees in the last 10 minutes, and the baby had shifted in a way that sent a particular kind of discomfort down her back that she'd been trying not to think too hard about. "What's your name?" she said. "Silas Mercer." "You got a family out there, Silas Mercer?" Something shifted in his face. Barely anything, a tightening around the eyes that was there and gone in less than a second. "No," he said. She didn't ask why. The way he'd said it made asking feel like stepping on something broken. "I have a chest in the back," she said. "It's heavy. It comes with me or I don't go." "All right. I'm not leaving my rifle." "Didn't expect you to." She looked at him for another moment. He sat there without fidgeting, without filling the silence with reassurances, without doing any of the things that usually made her distrust people more than if they'd said nothing. He just waited, like a man who'd learned that patience was the more honest currency. "My name is Evelyn Ashcroft," she said. "My husband died 3 weeks ago." He took that in. "I'm sorry," he said, and it didn't sound like something he'd practiced. "The wagon's done," she said. "I can't fix it." "No," he agreed. "You can't. Help me get that chest onto your horse, and I'll take you up on your offer." He swung down from the saddle. Getting the chest onto the horse was harder than either of them made it look. It was 60 pounds of iron and paper and everything Robert Ashcroft had spent 2 years of his life quietly documenting: survey records, forged signatures, witness accounts written in his small, careful handwriting, letters that incriminated men who wore good suits and sat in comfortable offices and had never once imagined a homesteader's wife would be the thing that undid them. It was awkward to move and unbalanced and kept wanting to tip. Silas managed it with a kind of grim competence that involved not saying much and not asking for help he didn't need. He secured it across the back of the horse with a length of rope from his saddlebag, testing the knots twice before he was satisfied. Then he turned and looked at her and at the horse and at the evident physical reality of the situation. "This is going to be—" he started. "I've managed worse," she said, which wasn't true but felt necessary. Getting her onto the horse behind him was an exercise in dignity, abandoned in favor of practicality. He offered his hand without comment. She took it without comment. She was up behind him in a way that was graceless and uncomfortable and involved a brief moment where she was convinced she'd simply missed entirely and gone straight over the other side, but she didn't, and then she was there, and the horse adjusted under the combined weight with a slight shift that communicated mild displeasure. Her arms went around Silas Mercer's midsection because there was nothing else to hold on to, and she was aware in a distant way of how strange it was. How strange to hold on to a person she didn't know, to feel the warmth of someone else's back against her, when the last person she'd been that close to was Robert. She pressed her forehead briefly against Silas's shoulder and breathed. He didn't say anything. He just turned the horse north and started moving. The first raindrop hit her hand about a mile in. Cold and hard and certain, the way mountain rain always was. Not a warning, just a statement. She looked back once at the wagon sitting alone on the trail, one wheel canted out at a wrong angle, canvas flapping in the wind. 3 weeks of her life in there, everything she hadn't been able to carry. She thought about Robert's voice the last time. She thought about his hands, which had always been rough on the outside and careful on the inside, and which would never touch anything again. She turned back around and held on. Behind them, somewhere on the lower trail, a sound that might have been hoofbeats and might have been thunder moved through the trees. She couldn't be certain which, but she'd learned in the last 3 weeks that uncertainty was a luxury. So she filed it away under probably both and kept her head down against the rain and kept her arms around the stranger's waist and kept going, the way she'd been keeping going since the night her husband stopped breathing, because stopping was not something the promise she'd made left room for. The chest pressed against the horse's flank as they rode. The rain came down harder. 6 miles north, a ranch sat in the dark waiting to decide whether it was a refuge or a trap. And somewhere behind them, men who had already cut an axle in the dark were realizing the woman hadn't died out there after all. The ranch appeared through the rain like something that had been waiting there a long time without expecting company. It wasn't much to look at. Silas hadn't been lying about that. A main house built from timber that had weathered to a deep gray brown, a barn that leaned very slightly to the east as though the mountain wind had been pushing on it for 20 years, and it had decided to compromise rather than argue. A smaller outbuilding with a collapsed section on one side that nobody had gotten around to fixing. A fence line that was solid where it mattered and forgotten where it didn't. A place that said plainly that one person lived here and one person's needs were all it had been asked to meet for a long time. Evelyn didn't say anything when she saw it. She'd lost the energy for first impressions somewhere around the 4th mile. Silas brought the horse up to the barn and dismounted first, then turned and offered both hands without ceremony. She took them. The dismount was worse than the mount had been. Her back had tightened during the ride in a way that made the last foot of descent a controlled fall rather than an actual one, and she landed with a jar that sent a sharp complaint from somewhere deep in her pelvis and made her breath catch audibly. "You all right?" Silas said. "Fine," she said, which was the answer she gave for everything now because the alternatives were too complicated. He didn't push it. He got the chest down from the horse with the same methodical competence he'd used to load it, setting it just inside the barn door out of the rain while he saw to the horse. She stood out of his way and watched him work. He moved like a man who did everything alone and had arranged his movements around that fact. Efficient, no wasted motion, no pauses where he might have turned to ask someone something. The horse got grain and a rub-down with a dry cloth. The stall was closed. He did all of this without being asked and without narrating it. She found that she trusted that more than if he'd been talking the whole time. "House is unlocked," he said. "Always is. Go on in and get dry. The chest, I'll bring it." She looked at him for a moment, then at the chest, then at the rain, then at her own body, which was making a compelling argument for getting out of the weather immediately. "All right," she said. The inside of the house was cold but dry, which at that particular moment was its own kind of luxury. A main room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies against one wall, a second room beyond a half-open door that she took to be a bedroom. Everything was spare, but not chaotic, the spare of someone who had once learned to keep a house and hadn't unlearned it, even when the reason for keeping it was gone. She noticed the way things were arranged, a coffee tin in exactly the right place, a coat hung on the same nail so many times the wood was worn smooth. The small disciplines of a man who lived alone and kept himself organized because the alternative was something he didn't want to look at. She got the fire started. That was one thing she'd gotten very competent at in the last 3 weeks, fire starting under poor conditions with limited materials. She had the kindling going before Silas came through the door with the chest, and by the time he'd set it down and gone back for her bag from the saddlebag, she had a real flame going, and the room was starting to think about warmth. He came back in and stood just inside the door, dripping on the floorboards, and looked at the fire. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I had nothing else to do." He pulled his coat off and hung it, and came to the fire and held his hands out. She moved over to give him room. They stood there for a moment, 2 strangers in a small house with rain hammering the roof, neither of them speaking because neither of them quite knew how to start. "There's coffee," he said, "if you want it." "Yes," she said, more plainly than she intended. He made coffee. She watched him without being too obvious about it, the way he measured the grounds by instinct rather than by any tool, the way he set the pot on the hook over the fire with the unconscious ease of 10,000 repetitions. He wasn't aware of being observed, or if he was, he didn't change how he moved. Some people perform domestic tasks differently with an audience. He didn't. She sat down at the table because standing was getting harder. The chair was solid under her, and she let herself settle into it fully, which she hadn't done, really done, without holding part of herself back in readiness to move, in longer than she could cleanly remember. Her whole body registered the change. Her shoulders came down. Her jaw unclenched. She pressed one hand flat against the underside of her belly, feeling the baby's weight, its particular solid reality. 3 days, she thought. Then she thought, that's not going to be 3 days anymore. The wheel was cut, she said. Silas had his back to her. He didn't turn around immediately. He set the coffee pot more precisely on its hook, adjusting it a fraction. Then he turned. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know." "I could see it from where I was sitting on the horse. The grain was—" He paused, appearing to search for the right word. "It doesn't break that clean on its own. especially not an axle that age. The wood was too dry to fail that way. She hadn't expected him to have looked that carefully. You didn't say anything. Didn't seem like the right time. He pulled the second chair out and sat down across from her, the table between them. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly than she'd been able to on the trail. His face had the particular weathering of men who spent most of their time outdoors. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but the kind of face that became legible over time, where the lines told you things the man himself might not think to say. There was something around his eyes that had been put there by something specific, not just by years. "Who cut it?" he said. She thought about how much to say. She'd thought about nothing else for 3 weeks, the question of who to tell and how much, and she'd mostly come down on the side of nobody until she reached the federal marshal in Bozeman. But she was sitting in this man's house eating his fire and about to drink his coffee, and the storm was making the windows tremble in their frames. "Men who work for Edgar Holloway," she said, watching his face. His expression didn't change dramatically. A slight tightening, the same thing she'd seen when she asked about family. "Edgar Holloway," he said, like he was confirming he'd heard it correctly. "You know him." "I know who he is." He said it the way people said things they'd decided they weren't going to expand on. "Then you know what kind of man he is." "I have a general sense of it," Silas said. He got up and poured the coffee, which wasn't quite ready but close enough, and set a cup in front of her. He sat back down. "What's in the chest?" "Evidence. My husband spent 2 years collecting it. Survey records that were falsified, land office filings that were forged, letters between Holloway and the county official who signed off on the fraudulent claims, witness statements from homesteaders who were pushed off their land when Holloway's forged surveys suddenly moved the property lines." She stopped. She hadn't spoken that much at once to anyone since before Robert died, and her own voice sounded strange to her. 43 families, Mr. Mercer. He's taken land from 43 families. Some of them have nowhere else to go." Silas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table surface between them. "And Holloway knows what's in the chest. He knows Robert had been collecting it. He didn't know how much until—" She stopped again. "Until my husband started trying to find a way to get it to the federal marshal without going through any local official who might be on Holloway's payroll, which is when things changed." "What happened to your husband?" She looked at the fire rather than at him. "They said he fell. Off a ridge he'd walked 100 times. She paused. "The doctor who examined him wrote it down as an accident. That doctor has an unusually nice house for a county physician." Silas was quiet. Outside, the rain picked up and there was a low rolling of thunder somewhere to the south. "I'm sorry," he said, the same way he'd said it on the trail. "How many men does Holloway typically use for something like this?" "He sent 4 when he—" She stopped, restarted. "4 men came to our homestead the week before Robert died, asking questions. Robert told them he didn't know what they were talking about. 2 nights later, he didn't come home from checking the south fence." She set her cup down. "I don't know how many he has now. He has money, which means he has as many as he needs." 4 I can manage," Silas said, in a tone that was matter-of-fact rather than boastful, which made it considerably more believable. "More than that gets complicated. You're not obligated to—" "I know I'm not." "I don't want you to think I expect—" "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, not unkind but firm. "Eat something. Sleep. We'll see what morning brings." She wanted to argue with that. The part of her that had been managing everything alone for 3 weeks didn't quite know how to stop managing. But she was so tired that the argument dissolved before it formed, and she thought that there was probably wisdom in the idea of not making tactical decisions at 8 months pregnant in a stranger's house in the middle of a mountain storm at whatever hour this was. "All right," she said. He warmed up what he had: dried beans, salt pork, cornbread that was 2 days old but still edible. And she ate it with more enthusiasm than the food strictly deserved because her body had apparently decided that safety, even temporary safety, meant it was now acceptable to be hungry. She hadn't felt properly hungry in weeks. It was strange how the body held things back until it decided it could afford to feel them. He showed her the bedroom without ceremony. "It's the only bed," he said. "I'll be fine. Mr. Mercer, I can't take you're 9 months pregnant and you've been sleeping in a wagon for 3 weeks. He looked at her levelly. "Take the bed." She took the bed. She didn't expect to sleep and she slept for 4 hours straight, which was the longest unbroken sleep she'd had since before Robert died. She woke to gray light at the window and the sound of Silas moving around in the main room, and for approximately half a second before her memory reassembled itself, she felt something that might have been peace, and then she knew where she was and why, and the weight came back, but it came back differently somehow. Lighter than it had been. Not gone, but shifted. She lay there for a moment with her hand on her belly and felt the baby move, a slow, purposeful rotation rather than a kick, like something settling more deeply into readiness. Not yet, she thought at it. Give me a few more days. She got up and went into the main room. Silas was at the table with a cup of coffee and a rifle across his knees. He'd been at the window, she could tell by the way he'd shifted when she came in. He'd been watching the tree line. He set the rifle against the wall with a casualness that didn't entirely conceal what he'd been doing. You were watching, she said. Morning habit, he said, which was not quite a lie, but wasn't quite the truth either. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him. The fire was going. The rain had stopped at some point in the night, and the light coming through the window was the thin, clean light that came after mountain rain, everything washed and precise. They're out there, she said. Not a question. He was quiet for a moment. I went out at first light. There are tracks on the lower trail, at least 2 horses. They found your wagon. She set her cup down. How long do you think we have? Before they come up here? Could be today. Could be tomorrow if they're being careful about it. He picked up his coffee. Holloway's men. Are they hired hands or are they the kind who know what they're doing? The ones I've seen, she said slowly, thinking of the 4 men who'd stood in her yard asking questions with their hands never far from their guns, know what they're doing. He nodded. That nod contained a recalibration she could almost see. Then they won't rush it. They'll want to know what they're walking into before they walk into it. That buys us time. Some. He looked at her. Is there anyone you can send word to? Anyone who can help? She thought about Margaret in Bozeman. Margaret, who was married to a school teacher and had 3 children and had no earthly mechanism for helping with any of this. She thought about the homesteaders whose names were in Robert's documents, but they were scattered across the territory and half of them were hiding themselves. She thought about the federal marshal, which was the answer, but the marshal was in Bozeman, and Bozeman was 3 days away and might as well be the moon right now. There's a federal marshal, she said, Calvin Rhodes. Robert had made contact with him. He's been... She stopped. Something occurred to her. Robert said Marshal Rhodes had been investigating Holloway independently for over a year. He just didn't have enough to move on him. That's what the chest is. That's what closes the case. Silas looked at the chest, which sat against the wall where he'd put it the night before. So Rhodes needs the chest. Rhodes needs the chest, she agreed. And the chest can't travel to Rhodes without going through terrain that Holloway's men are now covering. That's correct? He was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, something she was starting to recognize as what he did when he was thinking carefully. There are other trails, he said, slower, less direct. Men who know this range could navigate them. Men who don't know it would get turned around for days. You know them. I've ranched this land for 12 years, he said. There's not a ridge or a creek bed north of here I haven't crossed. She looked at him and thought about what it meant, what she was about to ask, not just for herself. For the 43 families whose lives were sitting in an iron chest 12 feet away. For Robert, who died for the contents of that chest, and who she'd made a promise to with his last strength wrapped around her hand. Silas, she said, using his first name without quite planning to, I know this isn't your fight. No, he said, it's not. He said it without hostility, just flatly, honestly. And I have no right to ask you to make it yours. That's also true. But I'm going to ask anyway, she said, because I don't have anyone else, and because I think you're the kind of man who would rather know he was asked than have it assumed. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a crow called once from somewhere near the barn and went quiet. The fire settled and snapped. What are you asking? He said. Help me get word to Marshal Rhodes. I don't need you to fight anyone. I need someone who knows this country to help me find a way to get that chest into federal hands without Holloway's men intercepting it. I was quiet for long enough that she was certain he was going to say no, and she was already in her mind recalculating. what she could carry, whether she could move the chest on a horse alone, whether she could navigate the trails without his knowledge. And then he said, "I'll need to go to Calver Station." She blinked. "What's at Calver Station?" "Telegraph. If Rhodes is what you say he is, he'll have a contact point, someone who can carry a message into Bozeman faster than either of us can ride." He stood up and carried his cup to the shelf. "I know the man who runs the station. He's honest. He's one of maybe 3 people in this county I'd say that about without qualification." "How far is Calver Station?" 8 miles. I can make it in 2 hours. Less if I push." He turned around. "You'd be here alone." That landed in the room between them and sat there. She knew what it meant. She was not going to pretend she didn't. "I'll be all right," she said. "You've got your rifle." "I know how to use it." "I know you do," he said, and there was no condescension in it, just a statement of something he appeared to have assessed and accepted. "You'll need to keep the chest out of sight. If anyone comes while I'm gone, you don't tell them anything. You don't open the door." "I've been managing that part on my own for 3 weeks," she said. "I know." He picked up his coat. "I'm not leaving because I think you're helpless. I'm leaving because it's the only thing that helps." She stood up. The movement was effortful in the particular way everything was effortful at 9 months, and she moved her hand to the small of her back without thinking about it. He watched her do it. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't want him to. "Silas," she said. He stopped with his coat half on. "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it. She could tell he was actually thinking about it rather than reaching for a comfortable answer, and she respected that. "Because 7 years ago," he said, "I lost everything on a winter night, and there wasn't a single person who could have changed that outcome, no matter how much I needed them to." He pulled his coat the rest of the way on. "This is a different situation." She didn't say anything to that. She wasn't sure there was anything adequate to say. He went out. She stood at the window and watched him take the bay from the barn and ride out. And then she turned back to the room and the iron chest against the wall and the rifle she'd picked up and set across the table within reach. And she said nothing to no one and got to the business of waiting. An hour passed. The fire needed more wood. She got it from the stack beside the hearth, which was something Silas had quietly restocked before he left. And she noticed that and did not know quite what to do with it, so she just put wood on the fire and sat back down. The baby was restless. Had been all morning, shifting in the particular way that made it hard to find a comfortable position in any chair or on any surface. A persistent low ache that she'd had before and recognized without fully wanting to acknowledge what it recognized. She pressed her hand to her side and felt a heel, or a knee, she could never tell, pressing back. "Not now," she said quietly and firmly, to the empty room. The heel or knee pressed back harder. She was about to get up and pace, which was the only thing that helped, when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse. Multiple. She was at the window before she'd made the decision to move. 3 riders coming in from the south. Coming at a walk. Careful, deliberate. Not the careless, fast approach of men who weren't sure what they were looking for. They knew exactly where they were going. The middle rider was heavy-set, wearing a good coat that was too fine for trail riding, sitting his horse with the posture of someone who was accustomed to having other people manage the difficult parts of things for him. The 2 on either side were different. They held themselves with the particular kind of alertness that meant weapons and the willingness to use them. The man in the center looked up at the house as they approached, and she saw his face for the first time. She'd never met Edgar Holloway. She'd seen him once, from a distance, at a land office in town almost a year ago, before everything fell apart. Robert had pointed him out, quietly, without turning to look. "That's the man," he'd said. "Don't let him see you looking." She had looked anyway, briefly. She remembered a broad, prosperous face, the face of a man who'd built something from nothing and had been telling that story so long he'd forgotten the parts he'd edited out. He looked older now. Or maybe it was that seeing him from 30 feet rather than 300 made the face more specific, more real. The difference between a problem at a distance and a problem at your door. He pulled up in front of the house and looked at the window, and she stepped back from the glass, and she did not know whether he'd seen her or not. She picked up the rifle. She heard him call out from the yard, a clear, almost pleasant voice, the voice of a man who had learned that certain tones carried further than threats. "Hello, the house. I'm looking for a woman who may have taken shelter here last night. No trouble. Just want to make sure she's all right." She said nothing. She stood at the side of the window, out of the direct sight line, and listened. My name is Edgar Holloway. I have business interests in this territory, and one of my employees reported a woman in distress on the South Trail yesterday afternoon. A pregnant woman. I just want to assure myself she's safe. She looked at the chest. She looked at the door. She looked at the rifle in her hands, Robert's rifle, the one he'd carried for 15 years and cleaned every week without exception, and which had never misfired in all the time she'd known it. Outside, Edgar Holloway waited in her silence, and she could hear in the quality of that waiting the thing underneath the pleasant voice. The calculation, the patience of a man who was accustomed to being the one who decided how things ended. She had maybe 90 minutes before Silas came back. She had an iron chest, a rifle, and a dead man's promise. She stood very still and thought about Robert's hands, and she did not move toward the door. Holloway called out one more time from the yard, the same pleasant voice, the same patient cadence, and when the house answered him with nothing but silence, he didn't raise his voice. That was the thing that told her the most about him. A man who gets angry when ignored is a man who still believes the situation can be controlled by force of personality. A man who stays calm when ignored is a man who has already thought past that stage. She heard him say something, low, to one of the riders. She couldn't make out the words. Then she heard hoofbeats moving, not leaving, moving, and she crossed quickly to the other side of the window and looked out at the angle that showed her the barn. One of the riders had gone around the side of the house. He was checking whether there was another horse, whether someone was here or whether the place was empty. He'd be back in 30 seconds with the information that the bay was gone and the barn was otherwise unoccupied, which meant he'd know two things: that someone lived here and that whoever it was wasn't home. She did the math on that in the time it took her to cross back to the door and put her hand on the latch. If they thought the house was empty, they might break in and search it. If they found the chest, it was over. If they didn't find the chest, they'd wait. Either way, she was not going to be better off with them inside and her inside and no room to maneuver. If she opened the door, she controlled the initial terms of the conversation. She had a rifle. She was pregnant. One of those things made her more dangerous than they might expect, and the other one complicated everything for them in ways she was willing to use. She opened the door. Holloway was still on his horse. He had the look of a man who'd been prepared to wait her out indefinitely, and her appearance in the doorway reset something in his expression, a quick flicker of recalculation that he covered with a smile that had been practiced so many times it had become almost genuine. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "thank goodness. We've been looking for you since yesterday." She stood in the doorway with the rifle held at a downward angle, not pointed at him, not slung over her shoulder, exactly where it would need to be if she needed it in a hurry. "I'm sure you have," she said. He looked at the rifle. His smile didn't change. "You've had a terrible ordeal. Your wagon, we found it this morning. That axle was cut," she said. A pause. Brief, controlled. The wood was old, brittle. "These things happen on—" "Mr. Holloway," she said, "we both know what happened to that axle. We both know what happened to my husband. I'd appreciate it if we could skip the part where we pretend otherwise. I'm tired and my back hurts, and I don't have the patience for it today." He looked at her for a moment with the smile suspended and something more honest underneath it. Not anger exactly, but a kind of assessment, the way a man looks at a problem he's underestimated and is now correcting for. The rider who'd gone around the house had come back and stationed himself to Holloway's left. The third man was to his right. She did not look at them directly, but she was aware of them, the way you're aware of things in your peripheral vision that matter. "You're a remarkable woman," Holloway said, and the infuriating thing was that it sounded genuine. "Robert was remarkable too. I want you to know I didn't— What happened to your husband was not something I ordered. Someone ordered it. There are men who take initiative," he said carefully. "Men who believe they're serving interests that haven't been articulated. I find that kind of overzealousness—" He paused, searching for the word. "Regrettable. I'm sure the families of the 43 homesteaders you defrauded would find your regret very comforting." The smile came down the rest of the way. He was still composed, she'd give him that, but the performance of concern was done. What was underneath it was not cruel exactly. That almost would have been easier. What was underneath it was simply the flat, practical look of a man who had decided a long time ago that what he wanted was more important than what anyone else needed, and had been confirmed in that decision often enough that it no longer required justification. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, what is it that you think you're going to accomplish?" "I'm going to accomplish getting that chest to the federal marshal in Bozeman." "And then what? You think one marshal and a collection of papers that will be challenged, disputed, interpreted by judges who have other considerations. You think that ends something?" He shook his head. "You're a widow 9 months pregnant on a mountain ranch with no horse and no way forward. Whatever Robert told you that chest could do, it can do exactly what he said it could do," she said. "I've read every page of it. I know what's in there better than Robert did by the end, because he was dying and I was reading it to him while he could still hear it. I know every name, every forged signature, every deed that was filed on land that wasn't Holloway land before he made it Holloway land." She kept her voice level because level was the only thing that was going to serve her right now. "So don't tell me what it can and can't do. I know what it can do." He looked at her for a long moment. The rider on his left had shifted, very slightly, a small readjustment of his position in the saddle, and she registered it and didn't react to it visibly. "What do you want?" Holloway said. "Name it. Whatever it is, money, land, safe passage, wherever you want to go, I can provide it. You have a child coming. You need stability. You need a future that isn't built on a crusade your husband started and that cost him everything." The thing about it was, she could hear that it was a real offer. He meant it, in the sense that he would actually do it, because the cost to him of buying her silence was nothing compared to the cost of the chest-reaching Calvin Rhodes. She understood the arithmetic. Robert had explained it to her once, how men like Holloway weren't evil in the way stories made them. They were just people who'd learned to put price tags on everything, including things that didn't have them. She thought about what she was going to say for exactly 1 second. "No," she said. He exhaled. Not dramatically, just a breath, controlled. The exhalation of a man closing one door and opening another. "Then I'm going to have to ask you to give me the chest." "You can ask," she said. "Mrs. Ashcroft." She raised the rifle. Not to her shoulder, just to hip level, the barrel coming up enough to make the geometry of the situation completely clear. "My husband taught me to shoot," she said. "He was very thorough about it. You're 12 feet away, and I'm not going to miss." The two riders went very still. Holloway went very still. There was a moment that had a particular quality to it, the quality of something balanced on an edge that could go either direction with very little encouragement, and she held herself as steady as she could and did not let her hands shake, although they wanted to. "This doesn't end here," Holloway said quietly. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But today it ends here." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned his horse, and the two riders turned with him, and they rode back down the south trail the way they'd come. And she stood in the doorway until they were out of sight in the trees. And then she stepped back inside and closed the door and put her back against it. Her hands were shaking badly now. She let them. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed and let the shaking run its course, which took about 45 seconds, and then she went to the window and watched the trail and the tree line and waited for Silas to come home. He came back an hour later, pushing the bay harder than he'd left with, and she knew from the way he was riding, leaning forward, focused, that something had happened at Calver Station. She had the door open before he'd dismounted. "The telegraph's cut," he said, dropping out of the saddle. "Line's down between here and Bozeman. Holloway's men got to it sometime in the last 2 days." She absorbed that. "When did you figure that out?" "Garrison, the man who runs the station. He's been trying to reach Bozeman for 18 hours. No response. He sent his son down the line on horseback this morning to find the break." He tied the horse and came inside, his coat wet through again from where the morning clouds had started dropping rain. "They cut it in 3 places, according to what the boy found before he turned back." She sat down at the table. The rifle was still on the surface, and she put her hand on it and then moved her hand away. "So Rhodes doesn't know?" "Not yet." He sat across from her. "Garrison has a rider he trusts, young man, fast, knows the back routes. He agreed to carry a letter to Rhodes directly. It'll take 2 days minimum, maybe 3. "Holloway was here," she said. He went still. "When?" "About an hour ago, him and 2 men." She described it, the approach, the conversation, the moment with the rifle. She told it plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment was something she had never had patience for and had even less of now. Silas listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He offered you money," Yes. And you told him no. Yes. He looked at her. She couldn't read the full content of his expression. There was something in it that wasn't admiration exactly, more like recognition, the look of someone seeing something they understand from the inside. He'll come back, he said. Next time it won't be just 3. I know. And he'll know I'm involved now. He'll know you have someone here. That was going to happen regardless, she said. The moment your horse tracks showed up near my wagon. He nodded, turned his coffee cup in that slow circle. 2 days for the rider to reach Rhodes. Another day for Rhodes to mobilize and make the ride north. That's 3 days minimum, assuming everything goes right, which it won't entirely. 3 days, she said, and then almost laughed, because of course it was 3 days. The number had been following her across Montana like a creditor. We'll need to move the chest, he said. Not far, but not here. This is the obvious place. There's a place I know up on the North Ridge. Old Trapper's Cache, built into the rock. If you know where it is, you can find it, and if you don't, you won't. Can we move it tonight? Better to, before Holloway comes back with more men. He stood up. I'll need your help to carry it. It's not far, but the terrain is rough. She looked at her body and then at him. I can manage rough terrain, she said. He looked at her the way she'd come to recognize as his version of argument, a moment of visible restraint where he clearly had a thought he was deciding not to say. All right, he said. They waited until the last of the daylight was going, that gray-purple hour when shapes became imprecise and distances tricked the eye. Silas carried most of the chest's weight, but the path up to the North Ridge required 2 sets of hands at the steeper sections, and she put her shoulder under the iron fitting and pushed when he pulled, and neither of them said anything about what it cost her or how many times she had to stop and let the ache in her back subside enough to keep going. The cache was exactly what he'd described. A natural depression in the rock face, widened by someone with a chisel a long time ago and fitted with a wooden door so old and weathered it looked like part of the cliff. Big enough for the chest, with a foot of space on either side. Silas moved some flat rocks against the door and stepped back and looked at it. And even knowing it was there, Evelyn couldn't see it clearly. How do you know about this place? She said. The man I bought the ranch from. He trapped these ridges for 30 years before his knees gave out. He looked at the cache for another moment. He said, hide your valuables in the mountain and trust the mountain to keep them. I thought he was being colorful. She thought about Robert's hands writing every page inside that chest. We'll trust the mountain, she said. Going down was easier than going up. But by the time they were back at the house, her lower back had progressed from ache to something more insistent and localized, and she moved her hand to it involuntarily twice before she managed to stop herself. Silas noticed the second time but didn't say anything, and she was grateful for that. That night they ate in a silence that was different from the first night's silence, less careful, more companionable. The silence of people who have shared something difficult and don't need to discuss it. He made a proper meal, salt pork and boiled potatoes and something with dried apples that was almost a dessert. And she ate all of it and was embarrassed by how thoroughly she ate it, and then decided she was done being embarrassed by her own hunger. Tell me about your son, she said after a while. He looked up. He was quiet for a moment. Thomas, he said. He was 4 when he died. He stopped. He had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is a terrible combination, but I keep thinking about what he would have been like with it, once he was old enough that the stubbornness started serving him. She looked at the table. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have. No, he said. It's all right. It's been 7 years. I can talk about it. He paused. I don't, usually, but I can. He looked at the fire. What are you going to name her? The question caught her off guard. What? The baby. You said she a few times without seeming to notice. She opened her mouth to say she didn't know the sex, and then closed it again, because the truth was she'd known, or felt she'd known, for a long time. Clara, she said. After Robert's mother. That's a good name, he said simply. She looked at him. Silas. He looked up. If something goes wrong in the next 3 days, if Holloway's men come before Rhodes gets here, I need you to know where the chest is, regardless of what happens to me. I need you to understand how important it is that it reaches federal hands. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said. You can't promise that. No, he said. I can't. But I know where the chest is, and I know the name Calvin Rhodes, and I know what Garrison's rider looks like, so I can identify him if he comes back with news. He held her gaze. I know what I'm doing, Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She wasn't sure he'd noticed. She decided not to point it out. All right, she said. She went to bed and lay there in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and the wind pick up outside, and she thought about the riders she'd seen on the South Trail, and about the cut telegraph line, and about Calvin Rhodes somewhere in Bozeman, who didn't know yet that everything was moving. And she thought about Robert's voice saying, "You get that chest to the marshal," and she thought about Clara, who was coming regardless of whether the timing was convenient, and eventually she slept. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of a shot. It came from somewhere south of the house, not close, 300 or 400 yards, and it was a single shot, the kind that doesn't get followed immediately by others, which meant it was a signal or an accident, or someone who'd missed badly on the first try. She was out of bed before the echo finished, her feet on the floor, her hand on the rifle she kept beside the bed now, because the situation had progressed past the point where courtesy required her to leave it in the main room. Silas was already at the window when she came into the main room. He'd heard it too, which meant he'd been awake, or he'd been sleeping lightly enough that one shot at distance was all it took. Saw a muzzle flash, he said, without looking at her. South Ridge, they're watching the house. A signal? Or they spooked something in the dark. Deer come down at night. He kept his eyes on the tree line. The moon was partial, enough to see shapes but not details. Either way, they're closer than they were this afternoon. She stood beside him and looked at the same darkness. How many do you think? Hard to say. That shot came from the south. If they're being thorough, and Holloway strikes me as thorough, they'll have someone on the north approach as well, which is where the cache is. Yes, she thought about that. Could they find it, without knowing where to look? In daylight, if they search methodically, maybe. It's well hidden but not invisible in good light. He paused. At night, no. Nobody finds that in the dark. Then we have until morning. We have until morning, he agreed. She looked at his profile in the dim light from the banked fire. He was calm. Not the false calm of someone suppressing fear badly, but the real kind. The calm of someone who has already moved past the question of whether to be afraid and into the question of what to do. She recognized it because she'd been working toward the same place herself for 3 weeks and had gotten there, mostly, somewhere around the second day after Robert died, when she'd realized that fear was available to her in unlimited quantities and was therefore not a useful currency. There's something I didn't tell you, she said. He looked at her then. All right. When Holloway was here today, when he said that what happened to Robert wasn't something he ordered, I believed him. Silas waited. I believed him because Robert told me, near the end, that the man he was most afraid of wasn't Holloway. He said Holloway was the kind of man who'd sell his grandmother, but would feel bad about it after. He said the man to be afraid of was the man on Holloway's left who never felt bad about anything. One of the riders who was here today, Silas said. The one on his left, tall, gray coat. He never spoke. She paused. Robert called him Crane. He said Crane was the one who handled the things Holloway needed handled without being asked and without leaving clean evidence. Crane, Silas said, like he was filing it away. He's the one who made my husband fall off a ridge he'd walked 100 times. She said it flatly, the flatness of something that had been faced many times and had not gotten easier but had gotten more precise. He's also the one who cut the axle. Silas was quiet for a moment. Does Rhodes know about Crane? Robert's documents have a section on him, 5 pages. She put her hand on the windowsill. I want you to know that so you know it's not just Holloway we're waiting for Rhodes to reach. It's Crane, too. He nodded. Thank you for telling me. They stood at the window together for another few minutes watching the dark southern tree line, and nothing moved that they could identify with certainty, just the wind in the pines and the ordinary noises of a mountain night. Then Silas said, Get some more sleep. I'll watch until morning. You can't watch all night. I've done it before. Silas? You're 9 months pregnant, he said patiently. And before you tell me again that you can manage, I know you can manage. I've seen that you can manage. But there are 2 of us here, which means we don't both have to manage everything at the same time. That's the point of 2 people. She considered that. We'll split it, she said. You watch until 3, then wake me. He started to object. 2 people, she said. You just said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, reluctantly, until 3. She went back to bed and was asleep within minutes, not because she wasn't worried, but because her body had finally overridden her brain's objections and made the decision for her. She dreamed of Robert, but not the bad version. She dreamed of him the way he'd been 2 years ago, before all of this, sitting on the porch of their homestead in the early evening, with his sleeves rolled up and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand while he watched the light change on the mountains, the way he used to do when he thought no one was watching, completely unguarded, completely himself. She woke at 5 minutes past 3 because Silas touched her shoulder once, lightly, and she was awake immediately in the way she'd learned to be. She took the chair by the window, and he went to the back room, and she sat in the dark with the rifle and watched the gray dark outside begin its slow change toward a dawn that was going to decide several things. An hour later, as the light was just beginning to differentiate shapes from shadows, she saw them. Not 2 men, not 3. 7 riders, coming in from both sides of the South Trail, moving in the deliberate spread formation of men who had a plan and were executing it. They were not attempting concealment anymore. They were past the stage of concealment. The man in the gray coat was at the front on the left. And even at this distance and in this light, even without having seen his face clearly the day before, she knew him. She went to the back room door. "Silas," she said, "wake up. They're here." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, which told her he hadn't really been sleeping either. He came to the window and looked and said nothing for a moment. She watched him count them, the same way she had. 7, she said. "I see them." He picked up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. He checked it with practiced efficiency, the check of someone who already knew the answer but checked anyway because that was the kind of person he was. "The telegraph riders had 12 hours, he said. "He'll reach Bozeman sometime today. And then Rhodes needs to get here. Yes. That's a day away minimum." "Yes," he said again. He looked at her, and something in his expression was entirely honest in a way that she found, strangely, more reassuring than if he'd been confident. He wasn't pretending the arithmetic worked out cleanly. He was just deciding that the arithmetic didn't change what he was going to do. "Stay back from the windows," he said. "If they breach the door—" "They're not going to breach the door," she said. He looked at her. "Because you're not going to let them," she said. "And neither am I." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he moved to the window and she moved to the other side of it, and outside 7 men came up the trail toward the house, and the man in the gray coat rode at the front without expression, and the morning was cold and clear and very quiet before what was about to happen. Then the tall man in the gray coat raised one hand and the riders stopped, and he looked at the house for a long moment before he looked down at something in his hand, a folded paper, some kind of document, and then he looked back up, and even from inside, even through glass, she could see clearly that this was a man who had decided how the morning was going to go and was now implementing that decision. Silas pressed his shoulder against the wall and checked the window angle and said, very quietly, "Whatever happens, whatever they say out there, don't open that door." She was already against the far wall with Robert's rifle in her hands. "I know," she said. Crane didn't call out the way Holloway had. He didn't use the pleasant voice or the concerned citizen framing or any of the performance that Holloway had brought to his visit the day before. He simply sat on his horse in the early morning light and looked at the house with the patience of someone who had done this kind of thing enough times that the waiting had stopped feeling like waiting and had become simply part of the process. That silence was worse than anything he could have said. Silas watched him from the edge of the window, keeping himself out of the direct sight line, tracking the positions of all 7 riders without letting his eyes settle on any one of them too long. The 2 flanking men had spread wide, one to the east side of the yard, one to the west, in a way that wasn't accidental. They were covering the exits. Not aggressively, not with weapons drawn, just positioned. The message was architectural rather than verbal. "He's done this before," Silas said quietly. "I told you," Evelyn said from her position against the far wall. "He's not like Holloway." "No," Silas said. "He's not." One of the riders at the back dismounted and walked toward the barn, not hurrying, and went inside. Silas watched that and felt the particular cold that comes from watching someone do something you can't prevent without escalating past the point of no return. The man came back out 2 minutes later and said something to Crane that Silas couldn't hear. Crane nodded once. They knew the chest wasn't in the barn. They were already eliminating locations. They're going to search the property, Silas said. Can they find the cash? In daylight, with time. He stopped. Maybe, if they know what they're looking for. He turned from the window briefly to look at her. How long have they had to prepare for this? How long has Holloway been planning to come after that chest? She thought about it. Since before Robert died. He knew Robert was collecting things. He didn't know how much until a month before. She stopped. There was a man at the land office in town. Robert thought he was a homesteader asking about survey records. He might have been Holloway's man. So they've had a month to study what Robert was gathering. Possibly. Then they know what they're looking for, Silas said. They know the documents. They know the chest. He looked back out the window. Crane had still not moved from his position, still had not spoken. And they know we didn't leave last night because they were watching the house. So they know the chest is somewhere on this property. Yes. The mathematics of the situation had gotten considerably worse in the last 60 seconds, and both of them knew it without saying it directly. The cash was their strongest card, and it was only good for as long as it took 7 motivated men to search a ridge they'd never seen before, which in decent morning light could be measured in hours. Then Crane spoke. His voice was not loud, but carried cleanly in the cold morning air. Not the practiced projection of a man making speeches, but the flat, sufficient volume of someone who simply expected to be heard. Mr. Mercer, he said, my name is Crane. I work for Edgar Holloway. I think you know why we're here. Silas said nothing. I want to be direct with you, Crane continued. We're not here to harm anyone. We want the documents that Robert Ashcroft assembled over the past 2 years. We know they're somewhere on your property. We're prepared to search the property if necessary, which will take time and will be unpleasant for everyone. Or you can tell us where they are and we'll leave without incident. He's lying, Evelyn said, low. I know, Silas said, the same volume. Or, Crane said, and there was a slight shift in his tone, something that dropped it a half register. You can send Mrs. Ashcroft out and let her tell us herself. Given her condition, I think a conversation in a comfortable setting would be preferable to, nobody's coming out, Silas said, loud enough to carry. A pause. Mr. Mercer? You'll want to step your men back from my barn, Silas said. The East man, too. He's standing on my fence line, and I'd like him off it. Another pause, longer. Then, without turning to look, Crane made a small gesture with 2 fingers, and both flanking riders pulled back incrementally. Not far, barely enough to be called compliance, but enough to demonstrate that compliance was possible if Crane chose it. Thank you, Silas said, in a tone that didn't contain any actual gratitude. Evelyn looked at Silas's profile and thought about what he was doing. He wasn't stalling randomly. He was talking to establish that there was a conversation happening, because a conversation was something that could be prolonged, and prolonging was the only resource they had right now. What time is it? She said quietly. He glanced at the shelf where a clock sat. 6:15. Garrison's rider had left Calver Station yesterday. Best case, he'd reached Bozeman sometime last night. But reaching Bozeman meant finding Rhodes, which meant wherever Rhodes was sleeping and whether his horse was fresh, and how long it took to assemble the deputies he'd need for a move on Holloway's operation. The minimum optimistic calculation put Rhodes arriving sometime this afternoon. The honest calculation was tomorrow morning. They had to hold until then. The chest is not on this property, Silas called out. A longer pause this time. She watched his face while he watched Crane's reaction through the window, and she could see him reading something in it. He doesn't believe you, she said. No, but now he has to decide whether to believe me or not, and that takes time. Crane said, Then you won't mind if we confirm that. I mind very much, Silas said. This is private property and you have no authority here. Mr. Mercer. You're not a lawman, Mr. Crane. You're a hired hand. You don't have the authority to search anything. Silas's voice stayed level. If you set foot on my property without invitation, I'll treat it the same way I'd treat any trespasser, and you can explain yourself to whatever law you manage to bring up here from the county, which will be an interesting conversation given some of what I've heard about the county sheriff's relationship with your employer. That landed. She could see it land even without being able to see Crane's face clearly, a stillness that radiated from him out to the other riders, a recalibration. Silas stepped back from the window. He kept his voice down. He knows I'm not wrong. Using the county sheriff complicates things for them because the county sheriff is on their payroll, and that's a thread that leads back to everything in your chest. So they can't call in local law. Not easily, not quickly. He checked the rifle again. Same result as before. And federal authority is what Rhodes has, which is what they're trying to prevent. He looked at her. How are you? The question surprised her out of everything else for a moment. I'm fine. You're back. She'd been pressing her hand to it intermittently for the last 20 minutes without fully noticing. It's manageable, she said, which was accurate and incomplete simultaneously. He looked at her with the same careful assessment he'd been directing at Crane's riders, and she could see him adding something up that she'd been deliberately not adding up herself. Evelyn, he said. Not now, she said. If it's Silas, not now. She met his eyes. There is nothing happening right now except those 7 men in the yard. That's the only thing. Do you understand? A moment. All right, he said. She turned back to her position at the wall and breathed carefully and did not think about the particular quality of the ache in her back or the intermittent tightening that had started sometime in the last hour and which she was not going to acknowledge in any productive way until this situation was resolved or until she had no choice. Outside, Crane had been talking quietly to the rider nearest him, a short, solid man who'd said nothing and moved very little since they'd arrived. That man now dismounted and began walking toward the house. Not fast, hands visible. One man coming to the door, Silas said. Messenger, she said. Probably. The knock, when it came, was 3 measured raps. The knock of someone demonstrating patience they may not actually have felt. Silas went to the door. He didn't open it. Say what you came to say. The man's voice was muffled through the wood. Mr. Crane says he's prepared to wait. He has enough men to watch every exit, and he's got supplies for 3 days. He says the woman needs medical attention that this situation is preventing. He says if she comes out now, she'll be taken somewhere comfortable and looked after until... Tell Mr. Crane, Silas said, that the woman doesn't need his medical attention and doesn't want it. Tell him the next man who steps onto my porch without an invitation is going to have a problem. A pause. He's going to search the North Ridge. Silas was quiet for exactly 1 second. She watched that second. He can walk the North Ridge all he wants, Silas said. It's federal land above my fence line. Good luck to him. The footsteps retreated. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. The cache is above your fence line, she said. Technically, it's at the boundary. The fence hasn't been moved in 12 years, but the original survey... He stopped. The original survey was drawn by a man who may have been on Holloway's payroll. She closed her eyes briefly. Silas. The documents in the chest would clarify the actual boundary, he said, with a flat kind of irony. Assuming we could open the chest and read them. Despite everything, despite the 7 men outside and the ache that was becoming harder to categorize as just an ache, she almost laughed. It died before it became a sound. What do we do? We hold, he said. That's all there is to do. He looked at the window. If they go up the ridge, I need to be able to watch them. The back bedroom window has a line of sight to the lower ridge access. I need to be able to see when they find it, if they find it. And then? Then I go out. She stared at him. You go out. There are 7 of them, he said, as if this were a straightforward observation rather than something that should give a reasonable person pause. If I stay in here, the situation stays static. They wait, we wait. And eventually they search the ridge and find the cache because 7 men searching a ridge in good daylight are going to cover a lot of ground. If I go out, they'll shoot you. They might, he said, or Crane will want to talk first because that's how he operates. And talking takes time. He looked at her steadily. It's the same thing I've been doing with the window, just at closer range. She thought about several things simultaneously. Robert, who had also made decisions based on arithmetic that put himself in the worst position, and Thomas, who had never gotten to be stubborn and grown, and Clara, who was expressing her position on the current situation with increasing specificity, and the chest on the North Ridge with everything Robert had bled for inside it. You can't go out there alone, she said. No, you're right. He said it simply, with no build-up. Which is why I'm going to go out, and you're going to stay at this window with Robert's rifle and cover me. He held up a hand before she could speak. Not to shoot anyone. Unless I tell you to, or unless something happens to me that makes it clear it's the only option left. just to make Crane aware that there are two guns pointed at his riders, and that complicates his arithmetic the same way his 7 men complicate mine. She looked at the window. The angle from here gave a clear line to most of the yard. What do I do if Holloway arrives? Holloway's going to stay back until Crane tells him it's safe. He's not the kind to be present for the unpleasant parts. He said it without contempt. It was an observation, accurate and cold. He pays Crane so he doesn't have to be. What do I do if Crane orders them to rush the house? He won't while I'm standing in the yard. You can't know that. No, he agreed. I can't know it. But a man like Crane doesn't rush things. He manages them. And as long as there's something to manage, he's going to manage it rather than force it. He checked his rifle one final time. I'm going to go out the back, come around the east side of the house, and approach from the corner where I have some cover, and they don't have a clean angle. You stay at this window. You keep the rifle visible. You don't point it at anyone unless something goes wrong. She wanted to say that this plan had approximately 8 things that could go wrong, each of which led somewhere bad. She wanted to say that going out there alone against 7 men was not a plan, it was a gamble, and she'd had enough gambles in the last 3 weeks to last considerably longer than 3 weeks. She said, "All right." He looked at her, and she saw something in his face that was not quite the thing she expected. Not resolution, not the hard set of a man who'd decided to do a hard thing. It was something quieter and more complicated than that. It was the look of a man who was aware that he was choosing to matter to this particular outcome, and that choosing to matter was something he hadn't let himself do in 7 years, and that he was doing it now with full knowledge of what it cost. "Keep the fire going," he said. "It's cold." He went out the back. She moved to the front window, positioned herself at the side of it, and waited. She saw him come around the east corner of the house about 45 seconds later, unhurried, rifle held across his chest rather than raised, moving to a position where the corner of the house was at his back, and he had an angle to the main cluster of riders without being in a crossfire from the flanking positions. He stopped there and looked at Crane, and Crane looked back at him, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "Mr. Crane," Silas said. His voice carried to her clearly through the window glass. "Mr. Mercer." Crane sat very still on his horse. "That wasn't necessary." "Neither was cutting a pregnant woman's axle," Silas said. A pause. "I don't know what you're referring to." "You know exactly what I'm referring to." Silas's voice didn't rise. It stayed in the same register, conversational, deliberate, the voice of a man who understood that volume was a tool, and right now wasn't the time for it. "And I think you know that I know that, so let's not spend time on the pretending part." Crane looked at him for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He almost smiled. It didn't reach anything. It was the smile of a man recognizing competence in an opponent rather than anything approaching warmth. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" "I want you to take your men and go back down the mountain," Silas said. "I want you to tell Holloway that the evidence against him is already out of his reach, and that the most useful thing he can do now is get a lawyer, because the federal marshal is on his way and there's nothing left to prevent." "That's not accurate," Crane said. "It's accurate enough to work with." "The marshal would need—" "The marshal has what he needs," Silas said, and she watched Crane's face go very still at that, watched him run a calculation behind his eyes. Garrison's telegraph writer was carrying more than one letter. He was carrying a copy. This was not true. She knew it was not true. She held herself completely still at the window and watched Silas say it with the calm of a man stating a fact. "So the chest on my property is only one copy of what Robert Ashcroft assembled. There's another. The marshal already has it. What's here is—" He paused, as if choosing the word. "Supplementary." Crane looked at him for a long time. She could see him assessing the claim, looking for the seam where the lie was, the tell, the small inconsistency that gave it away. Silas gave him nothing. He stood at the corner of his house in the early morning light, with the rifle across his chest, and he looked like a man who had told a simple truth and was waiting for the other person to finish catching up to it. "He's good," she said, to no one, very quietly. The solid man who'd come to the door earlier had moved forward slightly on his horse. His hands were not on his weapon, but they were near it. She raised Robert's rifle to the window frame, not pointing it, just visible, and the movement was small, but she saw it register in the way Crane's eyes tracked to the window and stopped. 1 breath. 2. The solid man eased back. "If what you're saying is true," Crane said slowly, Then there's no point in us being here. That's correct, Silas said. And if it's not true, then you're welcome to bring that argument to a federal judge, Silas said. I expect that will be an interesting conversation. Another long silence. The wind came down from the north ridge and moved through the yard, and somewhere in the pines a bird called and got no answer, and the 7 horses stood with their riders on them in the cold morning, and the morning just waited. Then Crane turned his horse. He did it without a word, without a signal that she could see, and the riders turned with him in a way that demonstrated they'd been watching for exactly that movement, and they rode back down the south trail in the same deliberate formation they'd arrived in, and she watched them go until the trees took them. She didn't lower the rifle for another full minute. When she was certain as she could reasonably be, she set it against the wall and pressed both hands flat on the windowsill and let herself breathe. Silas came back inside. He looked at her first, then at the empty yard, then at her again. He didn't believe you, she said. About the copy. No, Silas agreed. He didn't. Then why did he leave? Silas set his rifle against the wall and went to the fire and put a piece of wood on it. Because he's not certain, and a man like Crane doesn't move on an uncertain target when the cost of being wrong is that high. He stood up. He'll confirm with Holloway. Holloway will try to find out whether there's actually a copy in Bozeman. That takes time. How much time? Enough, maybe. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that wasn't relief. Too early for relief, but was something adjacent to it. A kind of stubborn, improbable satisfaction. She felt it too. She also felt, with considerably more immediacy, the tightening across her abdomen that had been intermittent for the past 2 hours and had just stopped being intermittent. She sat down in the chair, carefully. Silas was still looking at her. His expression changed. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. "How long?" "A while," she said. "I didn't want to. It wasn't useful to say it earlier." He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair, which put them at eye level, and looked at her with an expression that had moved entirely out of the tactical register and into something more personal and more alarmed. "How far apart?" She timed the next one. "About 7 minutes," she said when it had passed. He stood up. She could see him reorganize every priority he'd had 60 seconds ago into a completely different order, with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. "I don't have—" He stopped. "There's a woman in Calver Station, Mrs. Garrison. She's helped with births before. I know because Garrison told me once when, it doesn't matter, she knows what she's doing." "Calver Station is 8 miles, Evelyn said. "I can ride it in 40 minutes if I push. And leave me here alone." He looked at her. "Crane's not coming back immediately. He needs to confirm. He might come back in 20 minutes, Silas. We don't know." She breathed through another tightening. 7 minutes was generous. It might have been 6. "I need you here." He stood there with the full weight of that sitting on him, and she watched him work through it. She could see the calculation: medical help versus protective presence, 8 miles versus however long Crane needed to confirm what Silas had told him, her physical reality versus the armed men who might still be watching the South Trail. "Then tell me what to do," he said. She looked at him. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what was available and what wasn't. She thought about Robert, who would have panicked and been useless. She thought about what she actually needed from the man in front of her. "Water," she said. "Clean cloths. Keep the fire going." She paused. "And stay calm, because one of us needs to." "I'm calm," he said, in a tone that was approximately 80% true. "Silas." She reached out and put her hand on his arm, the first time she'd touched him voluntarily, the first time she'd reached toward anyone in a long time. "I've done harder things than this in the last 3 weeks. I need you to believe that." He looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face. "I believe it," he said. "That's what worries me. Despite everything, despite the men on the South Trail, and the pain arriving in waves that were getting harder to manage, and the 43 families whose future was hidden in a rock cache on the North Ridge." She almost smiled at that. "Water," she said. "Cloths. Fire." He went. She sat in the chair and breathed and looked at the window where the yard was empty, and the morning was coming in stronger now, the light sharpening the edges of things. She thought about Clara. She thought about Robert's hands writing careful notes by lamplight. She thought about the promise she'd made and what it had cost, and what it had brought her to. This specific chair in this specific house, with this specific man moving around behind her with the focused, slightly terrified competence of someone who was going to be useful because not being useful was not something he knew how to be. An hour later, somewhere down the South Trail, she heard horses again. More than 7 this time. Many more. And beneath the hoofbeats, just audible, the sound that Silas heard too because he stopped moving and lifted his head, and they looked at each other across the room, was a voice calling out something that resolved as it got closer into words she could make out. Federal Marshal. Nobody move. Silas went to the window. She watched his face. She watched it change. Rhodes, he said, and the word came out different from everything else he'd said all morning. Not flat, not tactical, not careful, just that. One word and all the weight it was carrying. She pressed her hand to her belly and felt Clara move steady and insistent, and she said, "Tell him we need Mrs. Garrison too." Silas was out the door before the hoofbeats fully resolved into something countable. She heard him on the porch. 2 steps. Then his voice calling out, identifying himself. And then another voice answering that was older and rougher, and carried the particular authority of someone who had spent 20 years making himself heard in situations where being heard was the difference between order and disaster. She couldn't make out all of it. She was managing other things. What she heard, in pieces, through the window, and between the waves of pain that were now arriving closer to 4 minutes apart than 6, was enough. Garrison's rider had made it. Rhodes had been in Bozeman, had been ready, had been waiting for exactly this kind of word for 14 months. He'd ridden through the night with 6 deputies and had come up the South Trail fast enough to intercept Crane's men still on the lower mountain, which explained the number of horses she'd heard and the voices that had been too many for just his party. Then Silas was back inside, and behind him came a woman she didn't recognize, heavy-set, somewhere in her 60s, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been told exactly what she was needed for and had already sorted through her priorities on the ride up. "Mrs. Garrison," Silas said, "this is—" "I can see who she is," the woman said, and came directly to Evelyn without ceremony. She took one look, asked 2 questions, how far apart and how long, and then told Silas to get out of the main room in a tone that did not leave room for discussion. He got out. What followed was the longest 2 hours of Evelyn Ashcroft's life, and she had recently had considerable competition for that title. Mrs. Garrison was not gentle in the soft, reassuring way of someone trying to make an experience pleasant. She was competent in the way of someone who understood that competence was the only real kindness available in this particular situation. She gave instructions and expected them followed. She didn't fill silences with comfort. She worked. At one point, between contractions, Evelyn heard voices outside, several of them, including one that must have been Rhodes, a low, deliberate voice that rose and fell with the cadence of someone issuing instructions to multiple people at once. She heard Silas's voice answering. She heard horses moving. She heard, much more distantly, something that might have been a confrontation further down the mountain. Voices raised, then quiet. The quality of a situation being brought under control rather than one coming apart. Crane, she thought. They'd caught up to Crane. She didn't have room to think about it further after that. Clara arrived at 11:47 in the morning, which Mrs. Garrison noted in a small notebook she produced from her coat pocket with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything. 6 pounds and some change. Loud. Immediately and unambiguously loud, which Mrs. Garrison said was the best possible sign, and which Evelyn already knew, because the sound of it went through her like a physical thing, not pain this time, something on the opposite side of pain, something she didn't have a clean word for and didn't need one. She held her daughter and looked at the ceiling of Silas Mercer's house and breathed. She thought about Robert. She let herself think about him fully, without managing it, for the first time in weeks, not the last image of him, not the still hands and the arranged face, but Robert at 32 standing in a field of their own land with his hand shading his eyes and squinting at the western sky and saying, without looking at her, "Evie, this is going to be something, isn't it? Meaning the farm, meaning the life, meaning all of it." Yes, she thought at him now. It's going to be something. Mrs. Garrison said, "I'll go tell that man he can come back in." And she said it in the tone of someone describing the most ordinary thing in the world. And she went to the door and opened it and said something brief and came back to continue her work. Silas came in slowly, the way large men come into rooms that have recently contained things they weren't part of and aren't sure how to approach. He stopped a few feet inside the door and looked at Evelyn and at the small wrapped thing she was holding, and he said absolutely nothing. His face did something complicated and human and not entirely controlled. "Come here," Evelyn said. He came. He sat in the chair she indicated, the one beside the bed she'd been moved to at some point in the second hour. And he looked at Clara with an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't succeeding, and Evelyn watched him and didn't say anything about it because some things don't need commentary. "She's loud," he said finally. "Yes. That's—" Mrs. Garrison said that's good. "It is." He looked at Clara for another moment. "She has your coloring," he said, and he stopped. "Robert's ears," Evelyn said. "I know, I saw it immediately." He nodded. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at his own hands for a moment. "Rhodes wants to talk to you," he said. "When you're ready." "Not today." He said, "Not today." "Tell me what happened." He looked up. They caught up to Crane's group about 2 miles down the mountain. 7 men and Crane himself. Rhodes had 6 deputies and the element of surprise, and he paused. It didn't go clean. There was a confrontation. One of Rhodes's deputies took a shot across the shoulder. Not fatal. Crane's group was disarmed and is currently sitting under guard at the base of the trail. And Holloway? Holloway wasn't with them, he said. He'd already ridden back toward town. Rhodes sent 2 men ahead to meet him. Given the telegraph's been cut, Holloway didn't know what was coming yet. A pause. He knows now. She thought about that. Holloway in some comfortable office or comfortable home, receiving the news that 7 years of accumulated power and carefully managed corruption had just become a federal matter. She thought about his face yesterday, the pragmatic flatness of it, and she thought about what happened to men like that when the structure they'd built finally came down. Usually they looked for someone to blame. Usually they spent a long time explaining how they'd been misunderstood. "The chest," she said. "Rhodes has it. We went up the ridge together, me and 2 deputies, and I showed them the cash." He rubbed the back of his neck. The deputy who opened it, young man, couldn't have been more than 25. He looked at the first 10 pages, and then he looked at me and he said, "This is everything," just like that, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Robert was thorough," she said. "Robert was thorough," he agreed. She looked at Clara, who had gone quiet with the particular concentrated look of a newborn figuring out the mechanics of the world. And she thought about Robert's careful handwriting and the 2 years he'd spent building something he'd known might cost him everything, and had spent it anyway because he couldn't find a way to live with himself if he didn't. She thought about the kind of man that made him, and then she thought about the daughter she was holding and what she wanted her to understand about her father, someday, when she was old enough. That he'd been afraid. He told Evelyn that himself, more than once. That he was afraid of Holloway's men, afraid of what he was doing, afraid of what it was going to cost. He hadn't done it because he wasn't afraid. He'd done it because he decided the fear wasn't the most important thing in the room. That was what she wanted Clara to know. Not that her father had been fearless. That he'd been afraid and had done it anyway, which was the harder and more honest version of courage. "Silas," she said. He looked up from his hands. "Thank you," she said. "Not in the way you say thank you for a small kindness, in the way you say it when the words aren't adequate, and you say them anyway because they're what you have. I know what it cost you to get involved in this. I know you didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. "You asked me," he said finally, "because I was the kind of man who'd rather be asked than have it assumed." He looked at her steadily. That was more perceptive than you had any right to be, given you'd known me for about an hour." "I had a lot of time to study people in the last 3 weeks," she said. "I suppose you did." He looked at Clara again. "She's going to be stubborn," he said. "I can tell already." "She has 2 stubborn parents," Evelyn said, and then heard the word and felt it land awkwardly, because Robert was present tense in her heart and past tense in the world, and navigating that divide was something she hadn't figured out the grammar of yet. She didn't correct herself. She let it sit. Silas let it sit too. Mrs. Garrison came back in and assessed the room with brisk practicality and said that mother and baby were doing well, that she'd be staying the night, that the men outside needed to find somewhere else to conduct their business, because the house needed to be quiet. She said this last part in a volume that was clearly designed to carry through the window to wherever the men outside were conducting their business. And Evelyn heard the voices shift and move and imagined Rhodes's face receiving this instruction from a woman in her 60s and finding it entirely reasonable, which told her something about Rhodes. Rhodes himself appeared in the doorway that evening at an hour when the light was going gold and long through the windows. He was older than she'd expected, past 50, with a lined face and gray at his temples, and the kind of eyes that had seen enough things that they'd arrived at a permanent state of careful rather than surprised. He held his hat in both hands, which she appreciated. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "I won't take more than 5 minutes. I know today's been—" He stopped, apparently deciding that any word he chose for what today had been was going to fall short. "How are you?" "Better than I was this morning," she said. He looked at Clara briefly, with the expression of a man who had children somewhere of his own and remembered something about that. "I've been after Holloway for 14 months, he said. "I want you to know what your husband built. What's in that chest. It's not just enough. It's more than enough. It's the kind of documentation that makes what comes next straightforward rather than complicated." He paused. "Holloway was arrested this afternoon at his home outside of town. He didn't resist. Crane is in custody. 3 county officials are in custody. There will be more in the days ahead." She thought about 43 families. "The land," she said. "The fraudulent claims are already being flagged. The process of restoration isn't fast. There's a legal process, filings, court orders. But with what we have, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when." He held her gaze. "Your husband knew what he was doing. Every page of documentation makes the next step easier. He made it very hard for anyone to find a way around it." She thought about Robert at his desk by lamplight. She thought about him saying, "Evie, come look at this," in the particular voice that meant he'd found another piece, another connection, another thread that led back to the center of it. He'd been almost cheerful about it some nights, the grim cheerfulness of someone doing necessary work that nobody else was doing. He knew it might not end well for him, she said. He did it anyway. "I know," Rhodes said. "I'm sorry I didn't get to him in time." There was nothing to say to that, and he seemed to understand it, and he didn't try to fill the silence with anything else. "I'll need a statement from you," he said. "When you're ready, not today." "Come back in 2 days," she said. "I'll be ready." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and thought better of it. Then he said, "You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Ashcroft." And she thought of Holloway saying almost the same thing 2 days ago from horseback in the yard, and the contrast between the two was so complete that she would have laughed if she hadn't been so tired. "My husband used to say I was just stubborn," she said. "Sometimes those are the same thing," Rhodes said, and put his hat back on and left. The night was quiet, in a way that felt earned. Mrs. Garrison slept in the main room. Silas had taken a bedroll to the barn, insisting without making a production of it. Evelyn lay in the dark with Clara against her chest and listened to the mountain at night, the wind in the pines, the occasional sound from the barn, the way the house settled around her with the particular creaks and adjustments of a structure that had been standing a long time and intended to keep standing. She thought about what came next, because her mind wouldn't stay still even when her body was demanding it. Margaret and Bozeman, who didn't know yet that she was an aunt. The legal process Rhodes had described, which would take months and would need her testimony and her presence and her continued existence as the person who could confirm what Robert had assembled. A life that was going to need rebuilding in every practical sense. Where she lived, how she provided for Clara, what she did with the land in her husband's name that was now hers, which was a question that felt enormous and remote simultaneously. She looked at the ceiling and felt Clara breathe against her and thought about Silas Mercer spending 7 years in a house that had been built for 3 people and used by 1. She thought about what he'd said when she'd asked why he was helping. 7 years ago, I lost everything, and there wasn't a single person who could have changed that outcome. This is a different situation. She'd understood it when he said it. She understood it more now. The specific quality of a grief that came from helplessness, from watching something happen that you couldn't stop, versus a grief that came from risk, from choosing to be in the middle of something rather than at a safe distance from it. He'd chosen, for the first time in 7 years, to be in the middle of something. She fell asleep thinking about that and woke in the gray early morning to Clara announcing her position on breakfast. And somewhere outside she heard Silas moving around and the sound of the barn door, and the smell of coffee was already coming under the bedroom door. And she lay there for a moment in the specific warmth of a room where someone had kept the fire going overnight without being asked. 2 days later, she gave her statement to Rhodes at the table in Silas's kitchen, while Clara slept in the back bedroom, and Mrs. Garrison, who had stayed on without being asked, moved around quietly in the main room pretending not to listen and definitely listening. The statement took 3 hours. Rhodes had a deputy who wrote it all down in a careful hand, and Evelyn told it from the beginning. The first time Robert came home from the land office with his face carrying something she didn't recognize until she realized it was outrage mixed with calculation. The first document he copied, the first name he confirmed, all the way through to the iron chest in the rock cache on the North Ridge. Rhodes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Is there anything you want to add that you think is relevant that I haven't asked about?" She thought for a moment. "Crane," she said, "don't let him reduce this to following orders. He had choices. He made them." "I won't," Rhodes said, and he said it the way people say things they've already decided. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn stayed at the ranch. She told herself it was practical. She couldn't travel with a newborn. The legal process required her proximity. Her testimony was going to be needed again as the cases against Holloway and Crane and the county officials wound through the federal system. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had nowhere else she needed to be, and here was where she was. And here had turned out to be something she hadn't expected. She and Silas didn't talk about it directly because they were both people who said things plainly when they needed to be said and let things develop at their own pace when they were still becoming what they were. He fixed the collapsed section of the outbuilding in the second week, which required her holding one end of a beam while he positioned the other, and this led to a conversation about the fence line to the north that somehow lasted 2 hours and covered his years on the ranch and her years on the homestead, and what they'd each thought farming was going to be versus what it turned out to actually be. She started keeping the kitchen the way she kept kitchens, which was differently from how he kept it. And he didn't say anything about it, but she noticed him adapting to the new arrangement without friction, reaching for things in their new places with the same unconscious ease he'd had with the old arrangement, just faster than she would have expected. Clara learned the sound of his boots on the porch floor and turned toward the door when she heard them. He noticed that and didn't say anything about it, and she could see that it had done something to him that he was not sure what to do with. She testified in federal court 6 weeks after Clara was born, in a courtroom in Bozeman that smelled of fresh pine and old paper, and the particular institutional seriousness of a place where things were decided and written down. She wore the best dress she owned, which was not very good, and she sat in the witness chair and she told the truth clearly and without decoration, the way Robert had taught her to think about difficult things. You look at the fact directly and you say what it is, and you don't make it bigger and you don't make it smaller, and you let the fact do the work because the fact is enough. Holloway's lawyer tried to suggest that Robert had been unreliable, obsessive, that his documentation was the product of personal grudge rather than investigation. She looked at the lawyer and said, "My husband was the most careful man I've ever known. He documented what he saw because he believed the truth deserved a record. If you'd like to challenge any specific document in that chest, I can tell you exactly when he obtained it, how he confirmed it, and who witnessed the original." The lawyer moved on. Crane sat in the courtroom for his own proceedings the following day and looked at the wall behind the judge's head throughout, and did not display anything that could be identified as remorse or its absence. He was convicted on 4 counts, including one that Evelyn had not known Rhodes was pursuing until the evidence was read into the record. Evidence that placed Crane specifically at the ridge where Robert had died. She sat very still when that was read. She didn't look at Crane. She didn't need to. It was enough that the record had it now. It was enough that it was written down. Holloway pled to reduce charges after 2 weeks of legal maneuvering, which Rhodes warned her about in advance, and which still landed badly when it happened. The specific frustration of watching a man of sufficient resources use those resources to soften the consequence of what he'd done. He would serve time, less than he deserved, more than he'd expected, she thought, given how long he'd lived inside the assumption that his resources made him untouchable. The 43 families, she got the count eventually, 41 families and 2 individual landowners, began receiving notices from the federal land office in the weeks following. The process was not fast, and it was not smooth, and some of it required additional filings, and at least 2 families had to fight supplementary challenges from Holloway's remaining partners. But the framework held. Robert's documentation was the framework. Everything else, the lawyers, the court orders, the land office filings, was built on the foundation he'd laid. She thought about him every day, which she expected to do for the rest of her life, and which she had made a kind of peace with. Grief was not something that resolved. She understood that better at 34 than she had at 20 or 25. It was something you carried, and what changed over time was not the weight, but your relationship to the carrying, what you called it, how you held it, whether you treated it as an obstacle or as evidence that something had mattered. Robert had mattered. He still did. The 41 families and 2 individual landowners getting their land back was one form of evidence. Clara was another. 3 months after the trial, on a morning in early spring when the snow was still on the upper ridges, but the lower fields were beginning to show green, Silas asked her to stay. He didn't dress it up. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. Her kitchen now, in the sense that she'd made it hers without being given permission and without asking for it. And he said, "I think you know I want you to stay. And I think I know that you know, so I'm saying it directly instead of waiting for it to become something we've both understood without saying." She looked at him. He was not a comfortable man to look at directly. Not because there was anything wrong with his face, but because his face showed things accurately, and accurate things were sometimes harder to look at than polished ones. He was looking back at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of vulnerability, which was not soft or yielding, but was instead just very honest, with nowhere to hide and no attempt to hide. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to forget Robert," he said. "I'm not asking you to. I know what loss is. I know what it is to love someone who isn't there anymore. I'm not asking you to stop." He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm just asking you to also be here." She thought about what here meant. The ranch that had been built for 3 people and become one person's way of not stopping. The north ridge where the cache was empty now, the chest long since in Rhodes's evidence room in Bozeman, the wooden door swinging open on its old hinges. The barn where the bay horse and her unnamed mare stood in adjacent stalls, which had resolved the question of what to call the mare, because Silas had started calling her neighbor, and it had stuck. She thought about what it meant to choose a life rather than return to one. She'd had a life with Robert that she hadn't finished living, and that life had been interrupted rather than completed, and there was a version of herself that could have spent the rest of her years oriented toward that interruption, waiting at the edge of something that was over, loyal to a future that no longer existed. Robert would have hated that. He would have found it impractical and said so, kindly, in the way he had of saying difficult things kindly without making them less true. She looked at Silas's hands flat on the table. They were rough, the way hands that did real work were rough, and they were still in the way of hands that had learned patience by necessity, and they were exactly where he'd put them, not reaching, just present. "Clara already knows your boots," she said. He looked at her. "I noticed that." "She's very perceptive for someone who can't hold her own head up yet." "She is," he said. "She's going to be trouble." "She's going to be remarkable," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that a yes?" She thought about the wagon on the trail with the cut axle and the storm coming and the chest with everything Robert had built inside it and the stranger who had stopped instead of riding past. She thought about the quality of that stopping, not impulsive, not performed, just a man who'd seen a situation and made a decision about what kind of person he was going to be in it. She thought about the fact that she was sitting here at all, that Clara was here at all, that 41 families and 2 landowners were getting their land back and Crane was in prison and Holloway was paying a consequence he'd never believed would reach him. She thought about all the small choices that had made that happen, Robert's 2 years of careful work, and her 3 weeks of not stopping, and a stranger on a mountain trail who had stopped. She thought about what you owed the living when you'd finished your obligations to the dead. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He didn't smile broadly. He didn't make a production of it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same careful steadiness he brought to everything, and they sat there at the kitchen table in the early spring morning with Clara asleep in the next room and the mountains outside the window old and indifferent and permanent, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else was needed. The once empty chair across from him had been filled for 3 months already. The house had adjusted to 3 people the same way it had adjusted to one, quietly, without drama. The way solid things accommodate new weight, not by breaking, but by settling deeper into what they're built on. Whatever came next, they would figure out the way they'd figured out everything else. Not perfectly, not without cost, but together, which was the thing that changed the calculation on all of it. Outside, the spring was doing what springs did in Montana, arriving slowly and then all at once, the way most things that matter do.